Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted so that I can finally leave. Here we have a Heliod, the Warped Eclipse deck. Now, technically this is Heliod the Radiant Dawn, but I would say it's the Warped Eclipse as the deck really revolves around that. The deck builder today is Leon, who sends their deck saying, the power level of the deck is good, but it feels really nasty to play against. The deck never really needs to build up a board, and winning super fast with Approach of the Second Sun is uninteractive in my pod. I'm thinking of pivoting to a playstyle that's still strong, but with a more creature-focused build. They say they're on a pretty restrictive budget, no more than $2 for a card, unless it's really fun. Now, we're going to have to figure that out, as fun is a little subjective, but we'll see what we can do with that budget. As always, the deck list for this deck is in the video description below. I highly recommend you go and take a look at it because this is a very fun deck. Open it up, take a look, see if you have any ideas that I don't, and if you do, I would appreciate if you put them in the comments so that we can help this deck be the best version of itself it can be. So, I kind of said it before, but this is a hilarious deck. I absolutely love it. I'm a little sad that Leon's play group might be a little too low power for it because this deck is extremely funny. So, who is our commander and what is our deck around it? So Heliod the Radiant Dawn is one of our Phyrexian shifting cards. So on the front half, we have Heliod the Radiant Dawn, which is a 4-mana 4/4. And on ETB, you return an enchantment that's not a god from your graveyard to your hand. This text isn't particularly important, to the point that you might notice that our deck only runs 8 enchantments, plus I would say Wave Break Hippocamp. I think that's it at a glance. So about 9 enchantments. So that first part of Heliod's text actually doesn't matter even a little bit. But that second part is what we want. So for 3 and a Phyrexian, we transform Heliod, and we can only activate it as a sorcery. So Heliod actually, the real Heliod, is actually 7 mana total, but most likely we can divide that over 2 turns. So 4 on one turn, 3 on the other. So what does Heliod the Warped Eclipse do? Well, it says you may cast spells as though they had flash. I already love this. And then it says spells you cast cost 1 less for each card your opponents have cast. This is so funny to me. The entire point of the deck is, once we get Heliod the Warped Eclipse out, is to make our opponents draw as many cards as possible, because each time they do, our spells get cheaper. Since they already they already draw guaranteed 1 card a turn, we can cast things like Fascination at a discount, where Fascination says each player draws X. But even better is that after we cast Fascination, we have guaranteed made our opponents draw a certain amount of cards. All of our cards will then cost that much less. So if you have a lot of X spells that draw your opponent's cards, or things like Windfalls and Wheels, they get cheaper and cheaper each time you cast them, making you and your opponents draw more and more cards. I've always liked group hug decks. They're a bit more of a strangle than a hug, and I think this is definitely kind of deck I like. So, with that in mind, let's see what we can do. Now, the main thing they've said is Approach of the Second Sun seems to be too good for their group, which means their group isn't playing probably counter magic and is probably particularly susceptible to instant I win plans. So Approach of the Second Sun, that's out. Alrund's Epiphany feels close at that same power level, so I would check with that. Platinum Empyrean might be too much for them to handle, but it's fine because it's a creature. But Laboratory Maniac and Psychosis Crawler might also be on the cutting room floor, because Lab Maniac is not fun to play. It has the same problem where you just, you get, if they don't have a counter spell, the game's over, because you can draw more at instant speed with like Brainstorm. And similarly, Psychosis Crawler represents, probably if Psychosis Crawler is alive for one turn cycle, that's it. And the fact that since it's an artifact, you can just flash it in for 0 mana with Heliod, the Warped Eclipse out, is incredibly powerful. It represents, you just wait until the turn on your opponents they have the least amount of mana collectively, and then you flash in Psychosis Crawler, and then you wheel as many times as you can, and that will probably defeat all your opponents. I want you to know, Leon, it is breaking my heart to weaken this deck. This deck looks like so much fun, and we'll have to do some cuts. I might come back to this at the end of the video to say in which ways I would adjust the deck if it stayed at the same power level. Maybe that would be helpful for you as well. But let's see what options that we can do to reduce the power. Those cards I mentioned that require interaction in terms of counter magic, namely cards like Approach the Second Sun and Lab Maniac and Psychosis Crawler, which can use a mix of instant spells to immediately win the game, we'll cut those out. And what we need to do is we need to grind our opponents out of the game without losing to the fact that we've drawn them probably 40 or 50 cards. So this is a little tricky. The first thing that came to mind was cards that benefited from you drawing a ton of cards. Now, things like Shabraz and works a little, because this card works a little like Psychosis Crawler in reverse. Instead of your opponents losing life, you're gaining life as you draw cards. But it's kind of important because this is just going to represent one really big threat. It's honestly it's weaker. It's considerably weaker because you're going to have to attack one opponent at a time, and they're going to have to not have removal. But it's really the only options you have is the on the creature side. If you want a bunch of these triggers, you are already playing at least Chasm Skulker. Playing a few more of these kind of effects would kind of do it. Let's say creature, and let's say +1/+1 counter. Now, you might notice that I don't think this is a particularly good idea, but it is the cleanest way. You can get real fair and use something like Nadir Kraken, which you have to pay mana for, but something as simple as, I picked the one with the hardest name to read. Something as simple as Latnap, wow, I can't even get this one. Latnam Adept will grow incredibly big, incredibly fast, but unfortunately, you have given your opponents the means to defeat you. So I'm a little less down for this kind of direction. Instead, I would like to consider the mill option. So let's go into the cards that draw as we mill. There are 3 that actually count. Jace is not this ability, but Jace's Erasure, which is whenever you draw, you will mill one opponent the same amount. This is particularly weak. It's not ideal, but it is the cheapest. Psychic Corrosion, which is just above budget, says whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts top 2 cards of their deck into the graveyard. I like this more because your opponents have to play around it to get to play around it to an extent. But now I'm saying it out loud and I'm realizing you can flash this in with Heliod just like you could with Psychosis Crawler. But I will say, for what it's worth, you do need a blue. You can't cast it out for free, which does make it a little less strong. But this also has a much higher threshold, where a Psychosis Crawler you need to just hit at max 40. Psychic Corrosion requires you to hit at max 50 cards. When you draw 50 cards, you will have milled your opponents completely. So This is, I would say, a bit of a slower way that's on board to defeat your opponents. Going back, Sphinx's tutelage goes one opponent at a time and has a trigger each time. This one is gonna be kind of painful to resolve, but has the highest chance. Like it's better than Jace's erasure because there's at least a chance that the two cards they mill are going to share a color, so you get a free activation. You're gonna want to have dice to do this on. To you put out a d20 about the number of cards you've milled, and they're gonna trigger it over and over again. So this might aggravate your opponents more. Teferi's tutelage is kind of a mix. It's a bit of a psychic corrosion, and what it does is one, it allows you to draw and discard a card, which is nice. But the other thing is it just doubles up every time you draw a card. Someone mills two cards. Now, this kind of effect will only take out one opponent in theory, because when you've drawn half your deck, that opponent will have milled their entire deck. So if you're not playing, and I haven't checked, yeah, you might want to have something. Elixir is spelled. No, elixir. There we go. You might want to have something like Elixir of Immortality, so that if you're going to lose by milling yourself out, you can just shuffle your deck back in. So the other options might work. Teferi's tutelage requires kind of Elixir of Immortality, but you're kind of guaranteed to draw it because you're going to go through the majority of your deck, and then you can cast it, and then hopefully with 2 extra mana, you can crack it, shuffle it, and go again. So these are options. They kind of have the same problem as Psychosis Crawler, where you can just flash them in through your commander. Like this deck basically runs on instant speed already. I don't know how to say this, but does your play group have removal? Like I will say, they're like Approach of the Second Sun is hard to interact with, but you have to destroy Heliod, right? Or Heliod. You need to get rid of him because otherwise you're going to lose the game. And I think for a type of commander that demands that kind of attention, we have a few of these. This is a really interesting one. I think this one is, you know, it promises the most fun for the table, and that's what's really catching my attention. So, what are our options to kind of power down this deck and have it so your opponents can deal with it? I'm thinking that the options are kind of low because everything I try to think of just this deck gets around. Like for example, Pathrazor of Ulamog and If That Betrays, I feel are like some of the fairest ways that you can use Heliod and clean up, a game. You draw a ton of cards, you flash in these creatures, and then it comes to your turn and you attack with them. Much like the creatures that grow as you draw cards, they represent a few attacks or one big attack, and after which you've given your opponents time to deal with it because the only way, like they have the removal because they've drawn into it. So with that in mind, I don't know exactly how to suggest this. Maybe we're looking at artifacts that take time to charge. So like I still like milling them out. So I'm thinking, let's put this in mana value. Where's 2? Grind Clock is a really, really slow one, but we can go all the way down to some of the really strong ones, like the Cannon. I believe is it Lux Cannon I'm thinking of? I'm just going to put that to the side for you. Yeah, Lux Cannon, where you put a charge counter on each turn, and then you destroy a permanent each turn. Otherworldly Atlas that each turn you put another counter on, and then players draw that many, which, unless it's a lot of money, it's $1. Are you running that already? You are not. You could be running that, as it does represent a lot of reduction in cost to do that. But Darksteel Reactor is wouldn't it be great if you can survive 20 turns in a row? It's a slower version of Azor's Eluk. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce that. These guys, these human advisors, which says that you need to go 5 rounds without taking hits. Darksteel Reactor, which I'm sure is actually too expensive for your budget. Yeah, it's $10. Is survive for 20 turns. Um, I don't think that's the direction you'd want to go, to be honest. I think I hate to say this, but this might be a situation where you just need to talk with your play group. You can still take out cards like Approach the Second Sun and just leave Lab Maniac in out of the ones I've mentioned, and just kind of lean in the fact that you're going to need to mill yourself completely out to beat them. Like, that's a lot of effort. I think that would be give them enough time to deal with you or to hold up a counter spell. But at a certain point, this deck might just be too powerful for them, which once again is heartbreaking. This is so funny to me. I think like cards like Finale of Glory, I guess you could go in a direction of White Sun Zenith. Like this is as fair as I can make this at this point. White Sun Zenith puts X 2/2s into play, and it's already an instant card, so no one can complain about it gaining flash. So you just make your opponents draw like 10 cards. You already need to pay white, 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 and then you're gonna put 10 2/2s minimum into play, which doesn't even it doesn't even defeat one opponent. Yes, okay. This is my answer to you. Play White Sun Zenith, play Blue Sun Zenith. Like, if you want the fair version of this deck, these are your options. Blue Sun Zenith might still be a little unfair here, so let's just ignore that. And instead, let's go to White Sun Zenith and just say it plays to the board. You're winning with creatures. And if you wanted, you could just run a search of create X, white, blue. Oh, and then we're going to say, can we say not permanent would probably be the best way to do it. Because I want instant or sorcery. I thought we had a way to do this. Well, let's do it like this. Say not is not a creature. Ooh, I wonder if you can hear that thunder. And then we're going to look for the cards that have X in it. Decree of Justice. This didn't work as well as I wanted. Entreat the Angels is very good here because to miracle it, it's not even, you can't even take advantage of it because it's on your turn. You're already playing Finale. You could find every single X spell, Hour of Eternity, especially the ones that are instant and not sorcery, and you could play every single one of them because that would be a creature-based setup that your opponents have the means to interact with that they would not be too upset about. That is going to be my general advice on the deck to power it down. Now, very briefly, I'm going to make some suggestions if you were to keep this deck at this power level, because this is incredibly funny to me. I would like, first of all, I think it wouldn't hurt for you to play a few other enchantment spells. Obviously, things like Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora, but those have a high price tag, but they'd be incredibly strong here. Smothering Tide, obviously, is one of the strongest cards you can play, but is way out of your budget. I will put it here for those who don't know. As Smothering Tide triggers every time your opponents draw a card, you will get tons and tons of treasure. Even just general removal spells or protection spells are worth having a few copies of because you will get them back every time you have to cast Heliod the Radiant Dawn. Something especially like, I'm thinking there is an enchantment in white, an aura that returns a creature to the battlefield. And I believe it's Gift of Immortality. Gift of Immortality says when the creature dies, return to the battlefield, and then you return Gift of Immortality back and attached. It's Theros too, so it's a flavor win. And one of the things that makes it really, really good is that if this process is interrupted and Gift of Immortality doesn't get to trigger and reattach itself to the same creature, the next time you play Heliod, you will get this Gift of Immortality back, and it can stay, and you can reattach it manually. Remember that when a card transforms, it doesn't lose its attachments. It doesn't leave play. At least these transform cards don't. So Gift of Immortality will stay attached even if you transform it from one version to another. So having a few more cards like this could be useful. You are playing few enchantments for Heliod's ability. After which, depending on budget and thoughts, cards like here, cards like Loran of the Third Path, which is just a bit above budget, cards like Kami of the Crescent Moon, which also will draw, this one's under budget, but this will draw everyone additional cards per turn, and Haunted Mine. Is it Hallowed Mine? What is the name of that card? Let's find each player draw mine. Howling Mine. Howling Mine is under budget and just is a nice way for each opponent to draw an additional card, therefore reducing the cost of your cards. And you can just flash it in on your last opponent's end step if you want to be the first to get the ability. So cards like this, any card that allows you to draw extra cards, your opponents draw extra cards, such as Quain, such as Lore Broker. These kind of effects, if you have a few more of them, I'd be pretty happy. And then trying to think of anything, I think Prosperity was one that was sticking out. Prosperity is what I wanted to suggest earlier because it's under budget, but it has the same kind of problem where it's incredibly strong at instant speed and your opponents can't interact with it, but it does represent the final mill for a lot of your opponents, where if you can make sure your opponents each have, let's say, 10 to 15 cards less than you left in their deck, you can do all your wheeling, all your drawing, getting your opponents to draw, and then Prosperity will cost only 1 blue to mill out and defeat your remaining opponents, as long as you can count the right number, which I think is very, very strong here. Now, I think you got all of the other ones that I was looking at. I think there was one more. You're not playing Folio Fancy. Folio Fancies. Players have no maximum hand size. Each player draws X cards. Same thing where you can't pump into it. Actually, maybe this is a good suggestion. This one stops you from being able to, because Heliod's ability does not affect activated abilities, so you can't actually put 0, can't tap this for 0. Yeah, okay. If you're still around watching this after I've gone into the more powerful version of your deck, I would say you can use Folio Fancies as another cheaper way to win the, not cheaper, another lower power way to win the game, because once you have Folio Fancies and each opponent draws 20, that is a particularly, it's not a lethal amount to then mill 20. It's not there to, all my words are together. If they have 30 cards in hand and you use this ability, each of them mill 30, that's not going to immediately defeat all of them, but it's going to put them into a position that on the next turn cycle, you can defeat them. I'm saying this, but you can just cast this on your last opponent's end step with Flash, make them draw a bunch of cards, then use the ability, go to your turn, untap, upkeep, activate it again. I don't know. I don't think it's in the cards. I don't think you can really weaken this deck unless you are playing the fairest strategies, unless you are playing big creatures. And even then, by being able to flash them in on your last opponent's end step and giving them pseudo haste in a way, you are getting around so much interaction. Okay, I think this deck is just too strong for the power level you're playing at. I wish I could tell you otherwise, but it does really feel like it. The more I read this card, the more I love it, and the more I realize it's just ridiculous fun. It has a strategy that encourages you to get your opponents to draw cards, and by using wheels or other cards that allow for all players to draw, you are taking the most advantage of it. You are getting far ahead, you have counter magic, you have cheaper spells, and the only way they're going to be able to consistently interact with you is by destroying your commander over and over and over. That is probably the lesson I'd have to teach them if I were you. I would sit down in the group, I would look at them and say, if you want to stop me, you have to Doomblade Heliod every time he comes out. That is the only real option. Because once Heliod is up and running, you have a lot of ramp I really like. You have a lot of different spells and a lot of different mana costs. This is one of the few times I didn't go straight to the curve because at a glance I could see that it was already you have a ramp commander and you have a lot of well-costed cards. I don't think your opponents will be able to deal with you. I would recommend between you and I, Leon, that you should encourage your friends or your play group or whoever you play against to maybe power up their deck a little bit, or perhaps put this commander to the side. This commander is very strong. And if you ever get to a point you want to make this deck stronger, I would love for you to send me another draft. This deck is so funny to me. I think it operates so well. It is so pointed at winning quickly and effectively. Like, I can't imagine what version of this deck exists with tutors where you can mystical teachings the next card you need on top of your deck. And even then, you probably don't need the tutors because you're probably drawing so many cards per turn that you can't. It just doesn't matter. I love it. I love it so much. I think, yeah, I think if you come back and you tell me you want to like Theorycraft or someone else wants the powered version of this deck, I think this deck can be brought up to a very high power. In the meantime, I think you might have to talk to your play group and help them defeat you because in the meantime, I think you're too far ahead with a deck like this. That mid to low power level decks will not, like at least decks that don't run enough counter magic are not going to be able to stop. All right, with that in mind, I hope this was helpful. I'm sorry I don't think I was able to do the thing you were looking for, especially because of the commander. I hope that doesn't discourage you. I think the deck that you built is really good and really fun. I want you to take away that I'm very impressed with the deck, and I think it could be really, really strong. And you know what? I think if you want to brew a different kind of deck or something like that, I completely understand at a lower level. And you should send that to me so that we can work on that. But for Heloid, it would be so difficult to make this deck weaker. You would have to go out of your way to to just basically not play optimally. You would have to play a bunch of cards with really a large amount of mana pips, and you'd have to just let your opponents beat you by not casting spells. Once again, White Sun Zenith is probably the win condition you'd be looking for, where you take out every other win condition and you go all in on this, because it's probably the most difficult to cast and the fairest card you can do it. And it also benefits by being shuffled back in your deck repeatedly, and with that you can do it more than once. So this would be my recommendation. But if you make another version, or if you want to explore this deck any further, The form exists in the YouTube video description below. I would love to see another draft. I would love to see any deck if anyone wants to see it. And as always, if you could like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube thing, it is very, very helpful for the channel. And I would love for that to help the channel grow so we can get more decks and see more kinds of decks like this that really excite me, and I hope it excites you too. All right, good luck.